Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome to the Technology Inclusivity Initiative virtual program. I'm Marty Rosendale, CEO of the Maryland Tech Council. The Maryland Tech Council is the industry trade association representing technology and life science companies throughout the state. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation unless you have a question or you want to make a comment. You can use the chat room this morning if you want to communicate with one another or the panelists. You can also use the Q&A function, and both will be monitored throughout the presentations this morning. So, smart and successful industry leaders around the world understand the value of inclusivity and take full advantage of diverse leadership teams. At MTC, our mission is to help our members and industry succeed. So we created the Technology Inclusivity Initiative to advance inclusivity within the state's technology industries and to drive technology-enabled socioeconomic advancement of underrepresented and underestimated groups. In other words, let's use technology to improve the economic and social divides and strengthen industry leadership. It will make us more competitive. Our program today is intended to set the stage and elevate the dialogue around action-based solutions. We've got an amazing panel this morning, and they'll tell us about some of the ongoing innovative efforts to drive inclusivity, and diversity in leadership, as well as some of the technology-enabled solutions that are already having a positive impact in our communities. We'll conclude today with the chair of our Technology Inclusivity Initiative, Latoya Staton, providing a brief overview of our plan for the initiative and how you can get involved. So you didn't join us this morning to listen to me. Allow me to introduce our moderator, Dr. Linda Singh. Linda is the CEO of Kaleidoscope Effect and the former interim CEO of TEDCO. She's a motivator and an author, and I highly recommend you read her book, Moments of Choice, My Path to Leadership. Not long ago, I had an opportunity to talk with Linda on the Capital M podcast, and I can tell you she's amazing. And above all else, she's a leader's leader. Linda, thanks for joining us this morning. The floor is yours. Please take a minute, tell us about yourself, and then take it away with the panel.
Good morning, everyone. And I hope that everyone is doing well on this beautiful morning if you're here in the Maryland area, because it is truly a beautiful morning. And the fact that we're starting to move out of this era of what we would consider to be a crisis, which brings me to myself. So I've focused for the last 38 years in bringing leadership to a wide variety of organizations. I've worked for large consulting companies, or a large consulting company for over 21 years, Accenture. And then I moved into the adjutant general role in the state of Maryland and a cabinet secretary. Bringing all of that together, one of the things that I do within my organization is to focus in on crisis leadership. And crisis leadership at the point when your organization, your team may be at its worst, or it could be at its best, and they're still kind of going through all these different challenges and don't know which direction to go as you're looking at your strategy, your technology, as well as your people. So I'm the type of individual that I jump into the middle and I work with you to bring the team together, to bring your technology together, to bring your strategy together. And the best part about it is I love working in the middle of chaos. And so if you find yourself ever out there in the middle of a crisis, and it could be a small crisis or a large crisis, but most of the time it's where people, process, and technology all seems to just clash. Our organization is the one to call. But with that, I think talking about diversity and inclusivity, the one thing that I don't have this morning, I was going to actually show my military coin, because on the back of my coin, one of the key values that I've stressed with all the military teams, and it's a challenge coin that I would hand out to key leaders who were doing great things, individuals who were doing great things. And one of the key components of it was diversity. And it was diversity in the perspective of looking at your organization and your team. Are they bringing the best that they can bring? Are you leveraging your whole team? Are you leveraging their capabilities? Are you leveraging the uniqueness of all of us together? And that to me was about teamwork. And that's what caused my team to be successful when we were actually experiencing the civil disturbance in Baltimore in 2015. It really wasn't necessarily just me as the leader. It was myself, it was my team, and that inclusiveness that allowed us to bring the best that we could of each other together and then to show up for our city. And so with that, I want to turn it over to one of our panelists, David Tone. David is the CEO of BTS Software Solutions and chairman for the Maryland Tech Council Board. He's actually going to provide us some food for thought in and around tech-related scenarios that has actually created some disparities that we may not necessarily be aware of. And I think it's the perfect way to start off the panel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, David. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Marty. Thank you for the panelists for joining us. Just a couple of words on part of the origin story of this initiative. Was a conversation between Marty and myself way back when in the fall, where a couple of vignettes kind of really exposed some of the challenges that I think the way technology is integrating itself into our day-to-day lives and some unintended consequences associated with it. So let me tell two very quick stories. Pre-COVID days, when you could go to the movies, and I think we're getting back there, I couldn't even tell you what the movie was, but I went to go to the movies in Towson the day of the movie and walked up to the box office to buy a ticket. And they point me to the kiosk, and I go to the kiosk and I go to select the movie, and the only seats available are the front row, because people had bought all the tickets online using their smartphone with their data plan and their bankable credit card or debit card in order to purchase that ahead of time. And so the only chance to see this movie was to sit there like this, staring up at a 40-foot screen. And needless to say, didn't go to the movies that night. But it got me thinking, as we start moving more and more into a cashless society, as just one aspect of how technology is embedding itself seamlessly and almost in a silent way into our lives, what are the second and third order effects of it? One could say that the movie, that process and reserving your seat in the theater is a better experience for everyone, and get to sit right where you want, get to sit with people you want. You're not fighting to get 4 seats together with your family. Has the unintended consequence of the people who don't have a smartphone and a data plan and a credit card are now in essentially a segregated movie experience. And frankly, in the Baltimore space, it's not an unfair statement to say that probably would fall along racial lines, if nothing else, maybe more often than not. And so is that an unintended consequence of this natural movement to an e-commerce environment or a digital economy? And what happens to the people that we're leaving behind as that moves forward and gets further and further into the way we interact with businesses around the city, around the state, around the country? The second scenario that did not personally experience, but was informative when talking to an Uber driver, again about the same time frame, is for people who are using Uber, and instead of tying it to a credit card, they tie it to a prepaid debit card or a cash card. And if when you finish your ride, there's not enough cash on that card to cover the cost of the ride, Uber won't let you book any more rides until you clear that debit and find a new means of payment. And I just checked their website and their FAQ, and it's still the case today. I had been told that you're banned from Uber for life. I don't know if that's true or not, but you certainly can't use these rideshare programs if you have any outstanding balance from any particular ride. So what of that? Again, the same, I need a phone, I need a data plan, I need to be bankable. But as cities, start looking at reducing the investment in mass transit as the rideshare economy continues to grow, it's a more efficient and effective way, many arguments there. Again, what are the second and third order effects of technology ostensibly making things more efficient, more effective for the community, is actually leaving a large segment of our population behind if they don't have those basic things? And so those two observations, shared with Marty and Vernon and a couple others over beer or whatever the conversation was, kind of started our conversation about, well, what can we as a tech council do to trigger the conversation about how does the digital economy, how does technology impact inclusivity and diversity and equity in our community, not just in the workforce, but in day-to-day life. And that was one of the genesis points for this initiative. And I think it's a decent stage setter for some of the amazing things that I think the people on the panel are going to speak to. So pending any questions, Linda, back to you. That's kind of part of how we started, and I'm excited to see where this goes.
Great, thank you. And David, we'll ask that you hold on because I'm sure that we will get some questions through this and I'll circle back around. But I think it's a great segue to our next speaker who's going to be sharing some insights from Abel's Foundation Disconnected in Maryland report, which is definitely a perfect segue when we talk about disconnected, right? And not being able to have access. And so John Horgan is a fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. And John, I'm going to turn it over to you because I know that you have slides that you're going to share. And so welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Linda. Thanks to everyone for taking some time today for this panel. And thanks for the invitation to have me talk about some data on the digital divide in Maryland. The report Linda mentions was published by the Able Foundation, but also done with the support of the Community Development Network of Maryland. So let me see if I can do share screen and we can get off to the races. I'm going to assume that everybody can see this and walk through some slides about the digital divide in the state of Maryland. So I want to set the stage for a second talking about the digital divide. I've been working on this issue in various guises for a while now. I worked at the Pew Research Center for a while, where we did lots of surveys on how people use information technology and also who doesn't use information technology such as the internet and why not if they are not using broadband internet. And then I worked at the Federal Communications Commission on the National Broadband Plan, which came out about 10 years ago, working on much the same issues. So the digital divide as a notion has been around for a long time. At various times over the years, the federal government has intervened to try to close the digital divide, but it's always been sort of a condition. Once the pandemic hit, the digital divide really has become a crisis, since so much of what we do in our daily lives went online, whether that was going to work, going to school, interfacing with a doctor or a medical professional. And it prompted what I call sort of a national smack my head moment, where people stakeholders realized for the first time in many instances that, boy, there are large sections of the population who don't have internet at home. And so part of the conversation since then has been defining just what we mean by the digital divide. And on the slide before you, the first bullet point talks about two elements of the digital divide: availability of infrastructure versus adoption of service. Availability of infrastructure simply means whether you have a high-speed network serving your residents. In the United States, for the most part, at least for the most part, and I'm talking over 95% of households have access to at least one wireline broadband option for service. In some instances, that wireline option may not be very fast, but it's an option nonetheless for the overwhelming majority of households in the United States, more than 95%. Then there's the adoption of service issue. That's a household's choice or decision whether to subscribe to internet service or not. And that's different than the issue of infrastructure availability. I'm going to get into some data on the share of households who adopt service, but I just want to emphasize that the bulk of my presentation is going to be on this adoption of service issue, leaving aside the availability of infrastructure issue.
Hey, Don, could we just ask that you put your slides in presentation mode so that we'll be able to see the graphs, please?
Sure. Let me see if I can do that. All right, better?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And apologies for not doing that sooner. So talked about availability of infrastructure versus adoption. Let's move to metrics that matter for the digital divide. David was talking about smartphones. We love smartphones. Smartphones are great. They're actually not, in my view, the key policy metric in focusing on the digital divide. Why is that? Well, we've heard a lot during the pandemic about the homework gap, the share of households who do not have access to the internet in a way that enables students to do schoolwork. And research shows that having wireline access, and that's either going to be cable modem service, fiber optic service, if you can get it, or digital subscriber line service, is associated with higher rates of class attendance and homework completion for households with children who are taking classes online. Why is the wireline service so important for that? Well, for one thing, it enables almost unlimited surfing online. So if you're going to do video, two-way video or streaming video, you really need to have wireline access. If you try to do that on a smartphone, not only might the speeds not be sufficient, you're going to run into a data cap on a monthly basis, so that you're not going to be able to do your schoolwork or do your telehealth sessions very long if you're reliant only on a smartphone. And in a similar way, access to computers is very important as a metric, because the larger screen experience is the tool that people need to carry out tasks like doing homework, telehealth sessions, and doing work. So those are the two metrics I'm going to talk about. And just to give a summary of what I'll get into more detail over, you can see that for wireline access, 77% of Maryland households have access to a wireline broadband plan. But two things drive, or one main thing drive gaps in adoption rates for wireline service, and that is income. We're going to get into that. But it's also important to know that the adoption gaps are statewide. So in Baltimore City, you have among the lowest wireline adoption rates in the state, about 60% of households. But you can also see in some rural counties that adoption rates are in that 60% range as well. In Baltimore City, affordability of service is largely driving that gap. In rural counties, it's a combination of affordability of service and not having adequate infrastructure in those counties. And you can see from that final bullet point, low-income households in Baltimore City and statewide have very low rate of wireline adoption, just a third in Baltimore City and about 40% in some of the low-income, among low-income residents in rural counties. So let's get to some data graphs that can help illuminate this data and go into it in more detail. So this graph just shows adoption trends in the past several years for wireline broadband adoption in the state of Maryland. And the numbers ticked up from 74% in 2016 up to 76%, or close to 77% in the latest American Community Survey data, which goes through 2019. Now, a lot of people are going to wonder, well, what's happened since the pandemic for the year 2020? If you look at national data, the rate of broadband adoption at home has changed just a little bit. There have been programs to try to get more people online since the pandemic began, and a lot of those programs have increased broadband adoption rates. But there's also data that shows that as many as 15% of households have experienced some interruption in internet service during the pandemic, and that's largely due to economic circumstances that befell them during the pandemic. Trends in computer adoption, you can see that hasn't changed very much over the past several years. These figures are for desktop or laptop computers. People may wonder about tablet computers. About 2/3, a little less than 2/3 of households in Maryland have a tablet computers. And people may wonder about smartphone adoption, and close to 90% of Maryland households have a smartphone, at least one smartphone in their home. Let's start to drill into where some of the inequities really start to be stark. And you can see that income is a major differentiator when you think about who has access to broadband, who has access to computers, and who doesn't. So overall, for households whose incomes are $25,000 a year or less, 47% of those in Maryland have a wireline subscription at home. And for upper income Marylanders, broadband adoption is the norm, over 90%. The same basic pattern with computers. So you do have sizable numbers of households in Baltimore with low rates of both computer and wireline adoption. It also plays out, although in a somewhat less pronounced fashion, by income, or rather race and ethnicity. White households in Maryland are more likely to have wireline broadband by about 7.5 percentage points relative to African Americans, and around 5 percentage points relative to Hispanics. And again, the adoption differences for computers are roughly the same across categories. You can see that Asian American households tend to have the highest rates of adoption, both for computers and wireline broadband at home. So we see many of these gaps, and we see a renewed interest on the part of a lot of stakeholders in trying to close these gaps. So where do we go from here? Well, there is some help on the way. There are $300 million in American Recovery Plan funds for Maryland for the digital divide. That includes funding for infrastructure, but also device and service subsidies, which would be particularly important for low-income households throughout the state. Programs for something like digital navigators. Haven't really touched on one of the issues underlying the digital divide, and that is digital skills. If you don't have broadband, you may not know how to use the internet in a safe way or negotiate computer sessions. So if you're going to be a new wireline broadband wireline adopter at home, you may need help. There are a lot of programs out there for that. Some of those unfold at local public libraries, but the funding in the latest legislative session provides funds for digital navigators, which are basically coaches that can go help people sign up for benefit programs aimed at getting resources to households in need and giving them some help with digital skills. There's also improved capacity in the state government. The Maryland's Digital Connectivity Act establishes an Office of Digital Inclusion. And that's important because the topic of digital inclusion can be overlooked among policymakers as they roll out new programs. And simply having someone whose responsibility it is to ask, well, how does this new initiative impact digital inclusion is very important. And finally, it's important just to continue to improve and develop the pipeline for service and device delivery to low-income households. We have at the federal level the emergency broadband benefit, which provides a $50 a month subsidy for internet service for qualified households. That's a big step in the direction of improving that pipeline of service delivery, but outreach is needed as well. So with that, I will conclude and turn it back over to Linda. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, John. That was great information, and I really appreciate it. And so next, we're going to go to someone that's going to talk to us about their innovative efforts that really illustrate how technology solutions is being used for the benefit of some of our state's most vulnerable citizens, homeless individuals, and families. So next, we have Winston Phillip, the man with two first names, which means he's very, very lucky. He's the president of Socioeconomic and the chair of Journey Home, Baltimore's Homeless Continuum of Care Board. Winston, why don't we take it away?
Thank you so much, Linda. We are, as you said, working in the nexus of disparities. Even the previous presentation was fantastic, but like all of our data, it only reflects who showed up for the data survey. And one of the things that we tackle with homelessness is this concept of the point in time count. The point in time count is exactly what it is: available information at a certain point in time, which always, almost by half, underrepresents the situation that we're dealing with. And so to try to mitigate some of that disparity, one of the things that we discovered was that there is a clog in the pipeline of providing affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness. It's those documents. As Tisha Edwards said, there's people that are moving around, even if it's couch surfing, even if it's going from shelter to shelter, have a tendency to either have documents stolen, misplaced, or destroyed. But that's the barrier to entry for working with the housing department to get into new housing that's available. So we have moderate but available housing stock, but there's this just giant barrier of document ownership at the time that you're trying to receive services. So we were fortunate enough back in 2018 when the previous director of Homeless Services, Jerry Ann Anthony, started working with Jesse Metcalf at Amazon Web Services with this idea of what if we were able to create a secure location for people experiencing homelessness at any level, couch surfing to chronic homelessness, to store information that they can digitally present at service providers to help them overcome this barrier of document presentation. So she said that to me back in 2018, and I was like, oh, wow, for real? We're going to do this? So we spent all of 2019 working with people with lived experience of homelessness, coming up with a design of a portal that they felt comfortable using. So part of the technology needs are not just the bright ideas, but the usable ideas. What would the population be comfortable using? So we worked with Amazon for a year almost, just going back and forth about, is this okay? Does this work for you? And they were able to develop a prototype that was able to be further developed by an organization called Two Bulls. I think they're in New York. So we were really excited about that. Working with partners, funding partners, the Rockefeller Rockefeller Foundation, other Kaiser Permanente, New America, the Annie Casey Foundation, to really pull this together. And that's another point I just don't want to slide by, is how much bandwidth it takes to get a solution to a population. We talk about smartphones in that they are ubiquitous. There are people that don't use them, but we know from the large organizations that produce these devices that there is wide adoption, billions of devices out there. But how do we turn that inward to the organizations and the populations that are normally left out of the conversation? So with all this bandwidth from all these providers and organizations, we were able to actually launch this product. So the impact is an individual or family that's experiencing homelessness can work with a case manager, because now we're solving the fact that I don't have a smartphone with a camera, as David was talking about. Work with a case manager to connect your original documents to this portal that then now can be shared with another agency. And one of the biggest things that people experiencing homelessness needed for this product to be usable for them was to revoke access. So once I share access with the housing authority, once that transaction is done, I can revoke access, then having a sense of ownership and privacy. So it's just not out there in the ether. It is actually still owned and protected by my own desires. And meeting those needs were very, very important to the project. We also were able to pilot with case managers to see if that flow was working for them. That really worked well. And I'm happy to say that the project is working very well. There's still an adoption process that we're going through to encourage people to use this service. But we're anticipating, with all the available funding now that is coming from the federal government, FEMA, et cetera, to provide homeless individuals with permanent housing, that this technology now can be used to eliminate one of the most invisible barriers. People think the barrier is choice, or that I don't want this service, or I don't want a house, or I don't. It's not that I don't, it's I can't. And this is the solution to the I can't piece of it.
Winston, that one hits home for me because having been homeless and a couch surfer and losing a lot of my documents and then having to pull all of that together and keep documents for the military, it just really changed my perspective. So granted, it was at a time where we didn't have cell phones and all of those things, but I wish you were around developing something like that for me a long time ago. You probably could have saved me lots of stamps, lots of paper, and lots of
right. I stamps. Stamps. What are stamps?
Yes, stamps.
Exactly.
So next we have someone that we have Angel St. Jean, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Black Brain Trust. She's going to share information with us about her company, which is focused on using data to create more equitable companies and a more equitable world. And I think that's something that we all on this call and really this webinar are striving to do with the technology and things at our hands. And so with that, Angel, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Linda and Winston. I didn't know all of what you guys did with that digital locker, so it's just really great to hear about that. I really appreciate the focus on the user. I mean, that's now that I'm running the technology company, I understand, the importance of that sort of beta testing and, getting the user feedback. But I think when we talk about equity, the idea is that the people who are most affected by an issue should be a part of coming up with a solution. So that was something that Jerry Ann was always focused on. And I think you as a chair have been doing a good job with. So yeah, it's just great to hear that. So yeah, on our end, my work throughout my career has been on focused on how do we improve outcomes for people who've been marginalized in our economy in one way or another. And if you've ever worked with me, you know that I sort of think out here. So I'm a person who I need to see the forest and the trees, I say all the time, and understand sort of the interplay between both. And what I think is important about technology as we focus on equity is that tech enables scale. And so when I think about sort of the forest of something like racial disparities and employment rates, you know that you have to be able to employ people of color at a scale that you move the needle on, those racialized employment outcomes. And so tech enables you to introduce a product or a solution like what we've created at a scale to be able to have that kind of impact. And so that's why we talk about creating more equitable companies that create a more equitable world. What has been missing, and I think you hear it over and over again, I think people on this panel can relate to it, people listening, is this question about what should we be tracking? How how should we really approach trying to live our commitments to equity? And so that's what we focused on and applied technology to that. So the Black Brain Trust, I consider us a social technology company that is focused on helping companies put their commitments to equity in action. We created a proprietary equity scoring system and business intelligence platform. The scoring system, it functions like a credit score. So it lets the company know, here's where you are, in terms of equity. And it's based on over 130 metrics that are industry specific. So, if you're a bank, you can be inequitable in different ways than a car company. So really focusing on the industry and letting the company know, here's where you are. And just like the credit score comes with a report, so the companies can know, here's where I need to focus my efforts to improve my score and become more equitable over time. The business intelligence platform, so the score, the equity score, we calculate once a year is the idea. And if you don't want to be surprised of what your score is at the end of the year, the business intelligence platform really allows companies to pull that, what we call equity KPIs from across your company, and sort of put them in one place so that you'll sort of know where you are throughout the year, and you can use that to guide more equitable decision-making in real time. The way that the tool works, after the company will fast forward, even though I know, again, now in developing a technical solution, that there's a whole lot that goes into the onboarding process. That's a conversation for maybe a panel later today. But once the company signs up, there's an account manager who basically shares a link to all the different people around the company that has this data that needs to be compiled and used for the score. And once the different people on your team around your company complete their sections of our sort of questionnaire, we validate the data that you provide to back up your answers to the questions, and then we provide you with a score. We are in sort of pre-beta testing phase, as I like to call it. So we're working with industry leaders to look at those metrics and make sure that they reflect a real understanding of the ways and processes and sort of decision points that companies have based on their industry. We also have a peer review committee of researchers and DEI experts that, is examining the score and making sure that, it stands up to scrutiny. And then we'll be launching next month, although I'm afraid to say that because I'll find out that there's some feature that we wanted to do that has, 10 activities involved with it. But yeah, that's the EIA score and the business intelligence platform.
Great, thank you. And Angel, just remember, that's what new releases are for. So don't fret, don't worry. There's always time and there's always a release to come. So just think about that and not try to get everything in before you really hit the street. And when I think about this technology, though, one of the things that I went in, even with the military, and the military is one of the most diverse organizations there are, when you think about it in total, but when you look at the senior leadership level, not necessarily very diverse. And in Maryland, what we found was when I started looking at my diversity numbers, we were not doing very well in the Asian American category, as well as our Hispanic American category. And then, Black American, we were doing well, but not at the senior levels. And so, my team did not understand what it was to be intentional about how we had to move the dial and what it would take to move the dial and how many years it would take to not only bring them in, but to grow them to the senior level. And so a tool like this would give an organization definitely a better view of not only how do we see ourselves, but how can we then take steps to move the dial. And so I love what you're doing, which then I think it really brings us to our last panelist. And folks, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box so that I can make sure that we start getting questions in, because I don't see any questions popping up there at this point. So our next panelist is Nick Culbertson, who's the CEO and co-founder of Pertennis and one of the founding partners of Baltimore Tracks, which is a collaborative initiative that is elevating diversity and inclusivity in Baltimore's technology companies. And Nick and Angel, I hope the two of you, if you don't know each other, I hope you get to talk, because I think that there's definitely some partnering that could go on there. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, sir.
No, Angel, I believe Sharad and you were coordinating, and we are on the list to beta. So hopefully that's still pushing forward when you guys are ready to go next month. So thank you for that, Linda. I appreciate the kind introduction. I really enjoyed the conversation today, talking about tech, transportation, and mobile inequality with David, broadband and infrastructure inequality with John, data storage inequality, which I think is super interesting, that what Winston mentioned, something I honestly had never thought about until hearing about the work that they're doing, and then actually measuring corporate inequality in tech with KPIs from Angel, which is something that I'm very passionate about as a leader of a tech company here in Baltimore. And I think what's interesting about all of these topics, going back to the highs and lows of tech in Maryland, is that some of the most interesting solutions are when you combine a problem's strengths and weaknesses. So in Baltimore, when we think about strengths, we've got a really great talent pool for technology. One of the reasons Pertennis has been so successful as a data science and AI company is we could recruit from really good computer science programs in the area, cybersecurity programs. We can pull from three-letter agencies and government contractors. There's a reason Amazon is moving out to this area because of the tech talent pool that you don't see in other parts of the country. We are also an incredibly diverse ecosystem. Baltimore is 60% Black. We have the ranked number 4 in HBCUs in the country. And at the same time, you put those things together and you see the Baltimore greater metropolitan statistical area does not rank very high when it comes to diversity in tech. And that's a shame that we have this really diverse workforce, this really strong talent pool, and we don't see diversity in tech overall. And I put myself in the category of one of those companies that on paper tried to do everything we were supposed to do when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We had the policies, we looked at slate metrics, we tried to use the right recruiting resources. But looking at Pertennis, I have to be honest that we were less than 5% Black when it came to our workforce. And that's a shame, just being a company that was able to be successful off of the Baltimore ecosystem. And so I started talking to other CEOs and trying to understand what we can do. And especially during the pandemic, what, really focusing on our circle of sphere, like our circle of influence, and controlling what we can control. And what was so fascinating is that I would know about some resources that were really helpful and not others. And other CEOs would know about some resources that I hadn't known about and not others. And what became immensely clear is the biggest break in the chain is the systemic bias and racism that exists in corporate leadership. And so I think executives like myself have to really step up and make sure that we're taking advantage of every resource that's available to make sure that we're building a really equitable workforce. And so to that end, I work with my chief of staff, Sharad Davis, and we founded the Baltimore Tracks Initiative, which is not an organization. It's not a not-for-profit. It's not even a registered entity. It is really just a movement of Baltimore tech and tech-enabled companies that want to just do better. And the way that we do that is that we came up with a list of commitments that we can make. It really just table stakes on making sure that as a community, we are doing everything we can to build a diverse workforce. And then sharing resources among each other to make sure that we're taking advantage of everything and actually having a significant impact. And so just the conversations from our monthly meetings, I found have been incredibly helpful. I've learned so much about the Baltimore ecosystem of opportunities like what Angel's put together that I don't think I would have known about had we not taken the initiative to come together and start talking about it. So we've started a website that's baltimoretracks.org. We're trying to reach out to as many tech or tech-enabled companies, any company that is recruiting from the tech ecosystem in Baltimore, whether you're tech focused or not. Technology's, enabling so many different types of companies, and are just looking to make sure that we're sharing best practices and learning from other companies to see if we can do better on any front. So it's been an incredibly humbling experience. I think it's been really interesting that, again, all these resources are available and it's just, not even hidden, just out there, and you need to go after them. And it's just been exciting that every company I talk to is behind diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Everyone is saying the right things. It's just about making sure that we're doing the right things and actually making the commitments. And so one of those 5 commitments is actually tracking progress. And we do that in a consistent way across the company. The reason we call it Baltimore Tracks is because if we're not tracking progress when it comes to diversity, we don't know if we're actually solving the problem or not. We could just be saying the right things and putting things on paper, but if we're not actually improving workforce diversity, then it's all for naught. So again, the website's baltimoretracks.org. If anyone is interested, would be happy to talk to you about it. Sharad, my chief of staff, is on the steering committee with a number of other companies that helped us found the organization, and was going to be here today, but is on its honeymoon this week. So could not make it, but would really be excited to talk to anyone if they're interested.
Great, thank you. And now I'm going to start with the questions. So we have some time for a few questions. And when I think about what has been said already, and there's a couple of pieces. So before you get away, Nick, and as well as others, I really want to talk about this piece of hiring, because it's easy for us to get them in the door. But what I've seen over my time is, minorities do not fare as well as non-minorities in organizations, especially tech companies. And so how do you really help to move the dial, not just recruiting, but recruiting, retaining, and even training those individuals once you get them to create a high-performing organization? And so what can organizations do if you have, 1 or 2 things that you recommend? Nick, Angel, Winston?
I'll jump in here. So first of all, I'd say get your equity in action score, because that'll certainly help. But when you think about hiring and advancement practices, there are definitely some, best practices in terms of, there's a lot of what do we call them? The affinity groups where folks are coming together and, sharing resources and information about, training and their own experience navigating ERGs. That's what I was trying to think of. There is, I think, a big part of the challenge is clarity around what's the expectations to be able to move into a higher level position. A lot of it feels very much like who you know and what your relationship is with certain people. And so I think transparency in terms of advancement practices and opportunities. I think that there's a lot around just mentoring in general. And I think the key to all of it is about intentionality. And I put just a note in there to what Nick was saying is that, you can't improve what you don't measure. So I think it's important to track what matters to your company. And if advancing, people of color up the ranks is something that's important, you have to track that. And then you have to understand from their experience. So back to what Winston was talking about, talk to those workers and understand how are they experiencing the advancement process, and understand where the barriers are so that you can solve for that in your strategies, versus sort of coming with, the perspective or the worldview of the leaders and the folks making the decisions, which can be limited. So I think, there's some specific best practices, but it's the intentionality and bringing the voice of the people who you're trying to advance into the conversation.
Angel, I think that's absolutely correct. I would also add on that in addition to tracking and measuring as a company metric, really needs to be top down. And for a venture-backed company like ours, that doesn't mean just like, the leadership team talking about it, that means the board. And so having a deliberate conversation with your board of directors, which by the way, are typically going to be predominantly male white because of the venture-backed community, about what it means to track those metrics and actually have those metrics in line and parallel with growth metrics. And I'm not saying that those things are mutually exclusive or work against each other, but they need to be on the same level, and understands that there's at times going to be trade-offs to make sure that you're actually tracking and focusing on those things. And it's not just a nice to have.
Linda, I have a question for probably Nick and Angel, but the larger group. Is there a substantive difference in the approach and the outcomes between small and mid-sized companies versus the larger ones, and the underlying technologies associated with it? The MTC has, everything from 2 people startups to, well-known Fortune 100s that participate and are members. And I'm just trying to get a sense for myself and the community. Is there, there's probably some underlying strategies and approaches that are common, but maybe there's some areas where you'd want to differentiate what you're trying to do within the workforce and the workforce development. Let me just leave it there for thoughts.
I'll just jump in real quickly and say that, in working with the community of Baltimore Tracks, we have companies that are 5 employees, and we have some that are hundreds that have really large engineering teams. And I definitely think there's differences in types of processes and workflows and just operational efficiencies when it comes to building diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging into recruiting pathways. But at the same time, I feel like they're not that different. And as a growing company, my focus was always, we got to hit revenue targets, we got to grow. And there were things that we could have been doing as a much smaller company to set us up to be a more diverse organization, especially like focusing on hiring diverse leadership. So as the company grows, it becomes embedded into ecosystem. And so I think even if you are a really small company, really small startup, it's not too early to think about your DE&I program. But logistically, I think there are lots of complexities and the differences.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly say, one of the processes in terms of larger companies is that you usually have multiple different hiring managers. So you have different divisions and people handling and approaching hiring differently than their counterpart. And so I think understanding that there is not just one person's responsibility to focus on, this goal for the company, but to understand how all the different decisions impact the overall, goal for the company. So I think for larger, I agree with Nick that a lot of the work is the same. It's just a matter of how you apply it across those different systems. So in a smaller company, you're thinking ahead about what our goals are and how you put best practices in place, like, for example, having diverse leadership who tend to hire more diverse workers as a part of your strategy. And with a larger company, you're saying we have all these different folks making hiring decisions across the company. How are we tracking that? How are we working with them to make sure that we are all advancing the goal? But it's similar strategies, I think, across, small and large companies.
And one of the things that I think it's important, and it was said already, is this whole thing of transparency and intentionality. So regardless of whether you're, 5 people, a 5-person organization, or if you're thousands, this whole thing around transparency and intentionality, the first thing that you do when you start a business, or at least the first thing that you should be thinking about, is setting your vision, your strategy, setting your core values. And if you bake it in at the start, then it becomes part of the culture, and you don't have to worry about revamping to kind of get it in after you've gotten up and running. And so I would say that if you're small, it's the best time to really put it as part of your culture and foundation of the organization, and let that just fuel from the bottom. And then great things will happen if you're very intentional about it. And so I think it won't happen if you are not intentional in everything that you do. And let's see, we have a question here. It says, given the sand uptick in social events of the past year, are you finding increasing engagement or resistance? So are you finding, a lot of resistance in terms of the level of engagement, or are you finding that more people are engaging because of what's going on in terms of these online social events in the last year?
I interpret that question as, given the all the events around Black Lives Matter the past year, are people more engaged? And I would say absolutely. We see that on my team. We don't see resistance because of it, but yeah, I think we see an increased engagement.
So this is going to be wacky, but I'll go for it. There's a lot of engagement. The motivation, however, is suspect. I'll just put it out there. There's opportunity to increase your bottom line by participating in a program that will, eventually support your shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the questions that's coming, and I'm sorry to jump ahead, is, how do you start? It starts with you. Like, why do you want to do this? Why are you, what's your motivation for actually changing the way your company is staffed and all these other things? And I've come across a couple of situations where the motivation is ultra suspect, only because it checks a couple of boxes. So we'll have a wide gate of people flowing through this, trying to be equitable as possible. But when you narrow it down, it really starts to look a little different from the motivational piece, and only the motivational piece will stick. The broadband wide adoption of any program is only beneficial for as long as it's beneficial. But when it starts to hurt, when you really have to invest, or wow, I really have to figure out how to change this, how do I tell my board that this is something that, hey, look, we got a lot of white dudes, the pain pressure sometimes outweighs the flimsy motivation at the beginning.
This is LaToya from Fearless. I was going to save these points for the end, but think this is a good time to jump in. At Fearless, being that we love all things Baltimore, and when the uprising happened, our leadership took a different stance and they leaned into it, right? Working with our team to have open conversations and open dialogue, and even took a look at our diversity hiring within. And unlike most tech companies that hover around 10%, we have a 50-50 goal. It is 50% women, 50% people of color by the year 2024. And we are well tracking to meet those numbers. So it starts with how leadership engages the team, opens that dialogue to ask the employees, what do you have questions about? Here's how it impacts the work that we do every day. And here's, how we can continue to not only show up for one another, but also show up for our community. And so it has to start with the leadership, and whether that's the board leadership or the CEO, but unless leadership buys in and brings along their executive team, then the conversations will go on deaf ears, so it's really about that intentional leadership.
So, and with that, let's kind of go back with, so now that we've hit a lot of different topics and subjects, what are some of the things that, we can do or we can recommend to really help make an impact in what's going on today, right? So this is going to be a long kind of term thing for the next decade. So what can we do to not only even help organizations, but to help our communities? So John, Winston, and even Latoya.
I'll make a quick observation about widening the pipeline for talent that is able to take jobs in the tech workforce. There's this incredible disconnect between workforce training programs and needs in the job market today. And some of those go to what are called middle skill jobs, which are well-paying jobs that may not require a college degree, but businesses have a tough time finding workers in those areas. And it's a great opportunity for communities of color to get training for those jobs if that's the kind of job they're after. And there's a disconnect going on. Some of that is underway in Baltimore to try to deal with that disconnect. There's a group called Bite Back, for instance, that is aimed directly at that, but I think we could do more to grow that throughout Baltimore.
I'm going to step in and challenge in a different way, right? Maryland is home to a lot of great universities, and everyone knows of UMBC. We know of College Park, but what about connecting and tapping into our HBCUs? Morgan, I think, is number 1 or number 2 in producing engineers, right? We have University of Maryland on the Eastern Shore. If we think about our rural and the agri-tech community, we have Bowie. So we have all of these HBCUs that are delivering top-notch talent that may not always be the first place that tech companies look when it comes to recruiting talented people. So how do we tap into that? And how do we develop those engineering by even opening up some of the internships? We have a very intentional internship program that we're doing this year, and it's all of our HBCUs. I mean, it's also UMBC, because that's where our CEO and COO went, and they have strong STEM programs. But we said, okay, Morgan, how do we tap into the talent in Baltimore City? How do we develop them to prepare them to work in this space? But it started with leadership in our executive team. I have to go back to that point, right? If you're going to have a 50-50 goal, and if you're going to tap into the ecosystem, you have to start at home. And that's, something that, we have to really focus on as a tech council as we look to have our statewide efforts, whether it's the Eastern Shore, Greater Baltimore, or Central Maryland, the corridor. How do we really engage all of our colleges and universities? And most importantly, how do we tap into our HBCUs who are delivering top talent that are being recruited for, by some of the largest bio companies, right? But do our bio companies tap into that talent? If they're going to Johnson & Johnson and Monsanto and some of the other ones, why are we not keeping them here and retaining that talent within the state? How do we tap into that?
Latoya, I think we should just stay with you, because to be able to talk about the MTC TI2, right? And the plan and how others can get involved. So I think it's the perfect segue, since you hit on our HBCUs. And because I will get in trouble if I don't mention this, but Towson University is actually one of Maryland's most diverse schools, even though it's not an HBCU. When you look at their talent pool, they actually recruit more Blacks than any of our other schools. So I just have to give a shout out to all of the schools that, recruit, definitely our HBCUs, but I also have to add Towson in there, sorry.
No problem at all. And again, thank you, Linda, and all of the panelists giving great information on sort of what's happening throughout the state. And as I mentioned, I'm Latoya Staten, last name pronounced, the A is long, strategic project specialist at Fearless, and also chair of the Technology Inclusivity Initiative. And I'm excited about this both on a personal and professional level. Professionally, I joined Fearless, who inclusivity is embedded in our soul, right? We say we deliver software with soul, but within our company culture, we're really focused on creating a world where good software powers the things that matter, right? And when you look at our vision, we're committed to that in sort of how we work. It's showing up for our people and having hard conversations about racial justice and leaving room for that dialogue. And our CEO, John Foster, always says, if any other CEO want to have conversations about how to engage their team, shoot him an email, give him a call. He's willing to help in that. We love Baltimore City, but if Fearless is growing in Baltimore City and we're not bringing our city along and being inclusive, are we really doing our job and doing our part? And I spoke a little bit earlier about making sure that our team is diverse, that less than 10% is what the tech industry is as a whole, and that 50%, that 50-50 goal that we have. And we're at about 150 employees, the same amount of contractors. Right now, we're just at 50% for women and over 40% for people of color. So it's that intentionality within the work that you do to help get things done. And so for me, when asked to chair this initiative, I'm like, oh, it's a no-brainer. Let's bring everybody along with us as we look to do this. So as shared earlier, this is a two-prong initiative. It is about helping to advance inclusivity within the state's tech ecosystem, companies and industry, and also to facilitate and enable technology that fuels socioeconomic development. So how can you tap in? The things you should know. It's statewide. We're in the city, there's Montgomery County, there's our rural. We're looking at this from a statewide approach and looking to connect and tap into companies and ecosystems on the Eastern Shore, Southern Maryland, Central Maryland, Baltimore, and the like. We look at this as being collaborative. You have diverse backgrounds of types of people and companies on this panel. We want to amplify the work that you're already doing. So again, we're looking to not recreate, but collaborate with what others are doing. And we're intentional. We're going to activate solutions within the state, and we're going to be intentional about our work. It may not always feel good, but it's going to be intentional. And part of my leadership is to make sure that we're working across all of the invisible borders within our state to keep things moving forward. So what will it look like? We have dedicated staff. We brought back on Stacy Smith, who many of you are familiar with, to be our dedicated staff and really help us in project managing this initiative as we move forward. This is greater than us. We're looking to establish a network of other companies and individuals who are committed, not just in words, but in your actions about moving this initiative forward. And that may mean sometimes donating to causes. Sometimes you do have to do that. And so we have the foundation that allows us to do that as well. And elevating others. If you know someone is doing good work, it's Baltimore Tracks, if it's Fearless, the work that Angel's doing, let's elevate that and be the microphone for all of the good things that's happening in the state as well. And then just under a year from now, we want to culminate all of our activities, the many activities that we'll do throughout the year through National Diversity Month and holding a summit where we've talked about some of the best practice and some of the things that we've done throughout 2021. And so, tap in, sign up for updates on the Tech Council's website. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us on the committee. Volunteer, encourage your team to volunteer, but your gatekeepers, your HR managers who control what happens through that hiring pipeline, make sure that they're also tapped into the work that we're doing. So we're excited to launch this initiative. We look forward to working with everyone. And at this time, Lynn, I believe we'll just open it up to a few more questions.
Actually, I think we're close on time. So what I would like to thank everyone for participating, because the sign that I'm getting from folks on the side is that we're going to wrap up and end here. And so thank everyone for your input today. I think one of the key messages that we should take away from this is that it takes one person to start an initiative, but it takes a village to move it forward and get the momentum. And so we have to be that village. We have to be the village for Maryland. We can make a difference, and we can actually, put Maryland on the map. Not that it's not already on the map, but we can put it on the map in a very different way and a very different perspective. And so I would challenge everyone out there to tap into the resources on this call, reach out to folks, reach out to the Black Brain Trust if you want to see how your organization is doing. If you want to get engaged in the community, please reach out to LaToya, John, and Winston. And if you want to go to work for Nick at Pertenis, please reach out to him as well, or get engaged with his organization. And David, he also has a great organization that if you want to work for him, great cyber resources and things. And so what I would say for everyone is network, and leverage your networks, because we don't do it enough. And so thank you so much. And I wish you all the best and have another beautiful Maryland day.